As you sit there in front of the comforting glow of the television screen, the world outside continues as normal. Often we are oblivious to the fact that ours is but one of many empires that have risen and fallen throughout the course of human history. Yet ours is not an empire of a single state ruled by some emperor. Ours is a global empire, an empire of connection, technology, and consumption. To most, the thought that this globalized, technologically advanced world is just as fragile as those that came before us seems absurd. Yet the deserts are littered with the great crumbling monuments of once seemingly invincible nations, the citizens of which would have thought the same. Those who understand the patterns of human civilization cannot look around and think that what they see will last forever. The great works we build today will be the crumbling monuments of some future desert. We must therefore look to the past to understand both present realities and future possibilities. So join us now as we explore the rise and fall of past empires. You shall journey through vast cities, witness the creation of grand architectural marvels, worship strange gods long forgotten, and see a reflection of ourselves in the citizens of these empires. We shall also witness the calamitous downfall of these civilizations. The once tall statues shall be torn down, the teeming streets will run with blood, and the knowledge and power of once unconquerable empires will be swallowed by the sands of time. Together, we shall chart the rise and fall of history's greatest empires. We humans have always had a fascination with lost empires and civilizations. Since recorded history, we have reflected upon the futility and doomed nature of our creations. In the 19th century, the poet Percy Shelley wrote a short poem called Ozymandias. This short piece was a powerful reflection on the impermanence of humanity's empires. Shelley told of a man who discovered the remains of a large broken statue of a king in the middle of the deserts of Africa. This statue was clearly built by some powerful yet long-lost empire and its ruler, King Ozymandias. The final section of Percy's poem describes the commanding yet futile words of the king himself, which are carved into his great image. Percy wrote, "And on the pedestals these words appear, 'My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.'" The Ozymandias of Shelley's poem was the pharaoh Ramses II, the greatest ruler of the ancient Egyptian empire. If one travels to Egypt now, many statues of long-lost pharaohs can be seen, marking the sites where once great temples and bustling cities stood. Ramses II was but one of many men who ruled over this powerful and advanced ancient kingdom. Shelley's words not only ask us to ponder the fragile might of lost empires, they ask us to think about how we view the nations of our own modern world. As powerful as the Egyptian empire was, as powerful as the modern Western world seems, all sooner or later are lost and forgotten in the vast deserts of time. Our journey shall begin long before the rule of Shelley's Ozymandias, for there were empires far older than Egypt's, civilizations whose golden age had passed long before the birth of Ramses II. Far to the east, between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, flourished the oldest of mankind's greatest cultures, Mesopotamia, a land destined to see witness the rise and fall of humanity's first empires. Mesopotamia, a region situated in modern Iraq, is where our modern urbanized world was born. When the Ice Age ended around 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, humans began moving into the region of Mesopotamia. Yet it was not until 4000 BC when humanity truly began forging what we would recognize as towns, cities, and eventually empires. Mesopotamia was a land of many different civilizations. The earliest of these were a collection of city-states, cultures built around a single city. Later on, the cities of this region would expand their reach to form the first true empires of Acadia and Babylon. Like many of our cities today, these cities were built around rivers. Rivers allowed for humans to settle down in one fixed place and begin making a living from agriculture. Before this, humans lived a nomadic life of hunting and gathering resources in different areas. The products of agriculture in the ancient societies of Mesopotamia were stockpiled and then doled out to different citizens by the ruling elite as a kind of wage. This allowed humanity to begin specializing roles. For instance, it was now possible for a Mesopotamian to become a soldier, merchant, artist, priest, doctor, or astronomer. The birth of many of the careers we still undertake today owe their origins to these river-based civilizations. Mesopotamia had the double benefit of being situated between two large rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. In fact, the name Mesopotamia is ancient Greek for between two rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates were the lifeblood of early human settlements, and the region between these rivers, known as the Fertile Crescent, was a land perfectly suited to give birth to great empires. Each city of Mesopotamia shared bonds of language, religion, and many social customs. Like today, Mesopotamia became a land where life revolved around large cities. These were the seats of kings, emperors, priests, and gods. Yet, just as in the modern world, there were constant tensions between the urban elites and the working country peoples. Mesopotamia was a land of beginnings, a land to which we moderns owe much. The people of Mesopotamia were the first to invent the system of writing, the wheel, beer, wine, agriculture, sophisticated warfare, and the demarcation of time into hours, minutes, and seconds. The building blocks of our modern world come from these ancient peoples from central Iraq. The cities of Mesopotamia were famed for their expertise in writing, law, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Often, they were very large, surrounded by extensive, formidable defensive walls, and hosted a series of palaces and towering temples known as ziggurats. These priests of ziggurats were seen as the mediators between mankind and the gods. As a result of these perceived relationships, the religious officials of mankind's first cities obtained powers which at first rivaled that of kings. The religion of this world was polytheistic. Mesopotamian peoples worshiped many gods rather than one. The four primary deities were An, Ki, or Ninhursag, Enlil, and Anki, who ruled heaven and earth, air and sea, respectively. These four gods, of which Enlil was seen as the most powerful, were the progenitors of many other gods, each taking an aspect of the natural world. For instance, Utu was the god of the sun, and Nana the moon. Eventually, kings began to take over many of the roles of the Mesopotamian priesthood, each king claiming a divine right to rule and acting as a personal spokesman for the gods. These kings made kingdoms out of the first cities of Mesopotamia. Some of these first Mesopotamian cities were called Uruk, Akkad, Babylon, and Eridu. The gradual increase in the economic power of one of these urban centers allowed for the formation of the first empire of our exploration, the Akkadian Empire. In around 2350 BC, the city of Akkad, under the rule of Zarkon of Akkad, conquered an empire stretching as far as the Mediterranean in the west, and as far south as modern Oman. The Akkadian Empire was the world's first multi-state empire, combining the Akkadian and Sumerian peoples of Mesopotamia into a single autocratic super-state. Sargon of Akkad was considered to be a wise and powerful leader, able to hold together many lands through the confidence, wisdom, and decisiveness of his rule. Yet the downfall of Akkadia would begin with Sargon's grandson, Narasin. Legend states that his son brought about the demise of his father's empire through the curse of Akkad. Narasin, during a campaign against the city of Nippur, had apparently destroyed a temple protected by Enlil, the chief god of Mesopotamia. As a result, the vengeful deity set into motion the demise of Akkadia. Enlil apparently brought about a great famine, causing the population to starve and humanity's first great empire to fall. Some modern scholars believe that the Akkadians' empire downfall was indeed a result of a drought. Archaeological evidence points towards a global drought at this time. The region of Mesopotamia saw increasing soil aridity and a lack of rainfall, causing the agricultural system which sustained urban life to suffer. There were also reports of an increased number of foreign invasions, especially from a people called the Gutians. Thus, humanity's first empire likely fell from a combination of environmental disaster and violent conflict. Both of these challenges which our modern civilizations constantly face. Yet Akkadia was not to be the last of humanity's or Mesopotamia's empires. Following the loss of Akkadian supremacy, the Mesopotamian city of Babylon under King Hammurabi assumed the seat of imperial power and ushered in a golden age of learning and human advancement. The Babylonian Empire was highly centralized and controlled. In fact, it is from King Hammurabi that we get the first written law code in history, known simply as the Code of Hammurabi. Yet Babylonia owed much to the Akkadians, whose empire they supplanted. The people of this new empire used the Akkadian script, and even referred to their empire as Akkadian in order to create a sense of continuity with the Sargon's once great realm. Yet like Akkadia before it, the days of the great Mesopotamian empire of Babylon were numbered. Most Mesopotamian states were either destroyed or weakened following an event known as the Bronze Age collapse, a worldwide civilization collapse on an apocalyptic scale. During this collapse, Babylonia saw an overwhelming number of migrants crossing the borders from the Levant, escaping from a series of interlinked catastrophes which were bringing down every major civilization. The Babylonian kings were completely overwhelmed by the sheer number of refugees crossing the border and were unable to stem the tide. This was a time of severe decline in Mesopotamia. Within 100 years, the Babylonian Empire and its capital would descend into violence and anarchy. The event known as the Bronze Age collapse resulted in the destruction of every major empire of the Bronze Age world. The refugees fleeing into Babylonia at this time had seen their entire world turned upside down. Once vast empires were collapsing, and the world of Ramses II, Perses Ozymandias, was being destroyed. To this day, modern scholars debate what caused the collapse of the Bronze Age's most powerful empires over 3,000 years ago. Most speculate that the Bronze Age collapse was caused by a combination of factors, including climate change, civil war, foreign invasion, and mass famine. Those factors uprooted the societies of the world, causing mass migration and chaos. Yet even today, the exact nature of the event is unknown. What we know for sure is that the Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BC was the end of an era. To the citizens of these crumbling empires, it would have seemed as if the world itself was ending. But before the collapse, the Egyptian and Hittite empires had reached the peak of their wealth, technological advancement, and power. The Hittites, with their capital in what is now central Turkey, extended their power across Asia Minor and the Middle East, and the Egyptians controlled a vast territory spanning from Sudan to Lebanon. The Greek peninsula was also flourishing at this time under the powerful Messenian kings. It is these Messenians who Homer refers to as fighting in the Trojan Wars. Men and women like Agamemnon, Achilles, Hector, and the famously beautiful Helen of Troy were the legendary citizens of this world. However, around 1200 BC, all three of these superpowers faced collapse. The Hittite Empire was completely destroyed. Every major Mycenaean city was burned to the ground. Every major settlement in the Levant was leveled, and the golden age of the Egyptian Empire was lost forever. At this time, the Egyptians' historical records show that they were under relentless attack from the sea by a mysterious people referred to only as the Sea People. No one knows where they came from or why they decided to attack the most advanced empire in the world. There is also evidence for cities across the Mediterranean coming under attack from the sea. From Greece to Israel, cities and kingdoms were falling one by one to this unknown seaborne terror. Archaeologists studying this time period see a wave of destruction spreading across the Mediterranean. The sea peoples of the Bronze Age collapse are one of history's biggest mysteries. They appear out of the chaos of a disintegrating world to wreak havoc and destruction. However, many agree that these men could not have brought down the world's most powerful empires alone. More likely, it is that these people were refugees themselves, forced out of their lands by famine and warfare as each civilization began to collapse and the crisis worsened. But what else could have caused such an apocalyptic scenario? Some scholars blame environmental factors for the collapse of so many empires. For instance, a series of devastating earthquakes hit the Mediterranean world at this time, causing catastrophic damage. There is also evidence for widespread famine caused by drought as a result of climatic environmental changes. As food began to grow scarce, each empire would likely have collapsed in on itself. How should we reflect upon the destruction of this world? The people of the Egyptian and Hittite empires would have seen their world as eternal and invincible. They were ruled by men who claimed to be gods themselves, men who commanded vast tracts of land and huge armies. These empires were flourishing. International trade and diplomacy connected the world around them. It was a better world than their fathers and grandfathers had known. Yet within a short time, their world collapsed, leaving an unrecognizable reality in the wake of famine, violence, migration, and environmental crisis. Our own world faces many of the same problems, but on a much larger and more serious scale. Environmental disaster is imminent for the modern world, and once again, the world is split into major rival empires. But in the place of Egypt, the Hittites, Mesopotamia, and Mycenae, we have Europe, China, the United States, and Russia, all possessing the military might to destroy the world around them. And like the Bronze Age, all nations are closely connected by trade, meaning that none but the most remote corners of the earth would escape a new modern Bronze Age collapse. In humanity's early history, the Middle East was the land in which great empires were forged. And following the breakdown of the Mesopotamian empires, a new power was rising in the region. This empire would dwarf any of the world had seen before it. An empire so large and powerful that its ruler was known as the King of Kings, the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, centered around the region today known as Iran, was founded in the 6th century BC by the ruler known as Cyrus the Great. This was the first and most famous of a series of empires which would arise from Iran. The Empire of Cyrus is often referred to as the Achaemenid Empire, denoting the royal dynasty of Cyrus. Under the leadership of Cyrus and his successors, the Persian peoples conquered every major power of the time, from Egypt and Mesopotamia to the edges of India and Greece. At its greatest extent, the Persian peoples ruled an empire spanning 8 million square kilometers. The empire remains to this day one of the largest to have ever existed. The Persian Empire was largely successful because of a formidable army. The Persians were originally a nomadic horse-riding peoples, but their armies used a variety of different units and tactics. Indeed, Persia was famous for its cavalry. The Persian army produced elite horsemen, camel riders, elephant riders, and chariot troops. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus stated that the armored Persian horsemen and their death-dealing chariots were invincible. No man dared to face them. Perhaps the most famous warriors of the Persian Empire, however, were the so-called Immortals. The Persian Immortals were an elite heavy infantry division of 10,000 men, handpicked for their skill, physical stature, and loyalty to the King of Kings. The unit was called the Immortals because they were never undermanned. If a soldier died, a new man would replace him to ensure that there was always 10,000 Immortals. Thus, to the empire's enemies, their army indeed seemed immortal, a frightening prospect in such a superstitious world. However, the Persian Empire was not only successful because of its army, it was also expertly governed and organized. The empire was highly centralized and maintained a complex bureaucratic framework of civil servants. The empire was also connected by the world's first postal system and a vast network of well-maintained roads. The empire also used a vast network of fire beacons to quickly send important messages from the provinces to the capital. By the standards of the ancient world, the empire was also a culturally tolerant state. Each region, known as a satrapy, was largely self-governing, and the empire did not interface with each nation's religious practices and cultural customs. Indeed, the empire covered so large a territory and governed so many different ethnic groups that imposing too controlling a regime would likely have been impossible for the time. Nevertheless, for the interests of efficiency, the language of Aramaic was used as a lingua franca between each nation. The religious tolerance of the Persian Empire is particularly famous amongst the Jewish community. the Old Testament reports that Cyrus the Great, on conquering Babylonia, released the Jews from captivity and returned them to their homeland. Cyrus was also recorded as assisting in the restoration and maintenance of holy places for various religions across his empire. The Persians themselves worshipped a religion known as Zoroastrianism. Although the Middle East today is noted for the dominance of Islam, Zoroastrianism was once the dominant religion of the region. In fact, there are still a few peoples across the world who still worship this ancient religion. Named after the prophet Zoroaster, who likely lived sometime between 1500 and 500 BC, the religion taught that there was only one God, Ahura Mazda. The chief priests of this religion were known as the famous Magi. Zoroastrian religion also taught that the key to living a good life was good thoughts, good words, good deeds, and that the only right path for a human being was the path of truth. Zoroastrianism constantly stressed the importance of truth, stating that the enemy of mankind is the lie. Indeed, the historian Herodotus tells us that from a very young age, young Persian boys were taught to do three things: ride horses, shoot bows, and always tell the truth. Herodotus tells us also that the greatest crime in the Persian Empire was lying. Aside from their vibrant religion, the Persian Empire was also famous for its cultural achievements. Persian craftsmen were recognized as some of the best in the world. They were especially skilled in architecture and rock carving. The Persian Empire was an empire of large cities, temples, palaces, and tombs, many of which were truly gargantuan and elaborately decorated. Persian artisans came from all corners of the empire, bringing with them expertise in a variety of fields. This expertise was especially visible in the great city of Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire. Persepolis was an immense city, taking over 100 years to construct. The Palace of the King of Kings was the most impressive structure of the city, boasting a vast hall known as the 100-column Hall, in which the King of Kings greeted his subjects. Each column in the Grand Hall was around 20 meters tall and richly decorated. In order to enter the palace, a visitor needed to enter an enormous structure known as the Gate of All Nations, a large gate and room supported by towering columns and flanked by two huge stone creatures known as Lamassu, a type of protective deity consisting of a lion's body and a man's head. Persepolis, at its height, was the largest, richest, and most impressive city in the world, but it was but one of many cities within the vast Persian Empire. The Persian Empire reached its height in the 5th century BC and began looking to expand beyond Asia and into Europe. The Greeks had always been a thorn in the side of the Persian kings, especially the Athenians and the Spartans. After the Athenians had supported a failed rebellion within the empire, the Persians felt they needed to put down the meddlesome Greeks once and for all. In 480 BC, King Xerxes I entered Greece at the head of the largest military expedition the world had ever seen. A force of between 100 and 300,000 Persian troops bore down on an alliance of fiercely independent Greek states. The expedition began well, as Xerxes defeated a Greek coalition army under the Spartan king Leonidas and the Battle of Thermopylae. The Persians then captured and razed Athens to the ground, forcing the population to flee. However, the tables eventually turned when the Persian navy was outmaneuvered and destroyed, cutting supply lines for the vast Persian army and forcing them to retreat. Following this defeat, the Persian Empire began to lose parts of its western satrapies to the Athenians and Spartans, and various parts of the empire, such as Egypt, rebelled from the rule of the great king. Although the Persians were able to crush these revolts and hold the line against the expanding Greek states, the first cracks were beginning to show in their empire. As the empire grew weaker and weaker, some began to observe the riches of the Persians with greedy eyes. The end of the vast Persian Empire was not to come from some other imperial state, but from a relatively small northern Greek kingdom called Macedon. Since the Persian defeat, the kingdom had expanded rapidly to control almost the entirety of the Greek peninsula. Following the assassination of his father, a young man called Alexander became king of this rising kingdom. Alexander, a strong and visionary young man, had great aspirations. His greatest desire was to lead an army into the lands of Persia and become the world's greatest conqueror. King Alexander, destined to be known as the Great, gathered an army of elite Macedonian soldiers and Greek allies, and within 2 decades conquered the vast Persian Empire, leaving the great king of Persia dead and Persepolis a smoldering ruin. Alexander's empire pushed even further than the Persians had dared, reaching even as far as the borders of India. His empire was the largest the world had ever seen, yet like all empires, it was doomed. Alexander had planned to conquer Europe also, yet his plans were never meant to be. In 323 BC, Alexander, the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen, died of an unknown disease. He was a man so brilliant and so powerful that the Egyptians considered him to be the son of Amun-Ra, the king of all gods. Yet the nature of his death proved his mortal fragility. Alexander's biggest mistake was that he had failed to name a successor to rule his great empire. Within a decade, his great achievement was torn apart by competing generals, each looking to carve off a portion of Alexander's empire for himself. Alexander had destroyed Persia, the greatest empire in history, yet his lack of foresight meant that the vast Alexandrian empire was doomed to fragment. The Persian Empire had been destroyed by the greed and ambition of one man. The empire that grew up to replace it was torn apart by the greed of many men. Alexander, like the Persian king of kings, was thought of as divine, and his empire seemed destined to last for an eternity. Yet the destiny of all mortal men is to die and empires fall. We must now leave the ashes of Persia behind us and turn to an empire so powerful and long-lasting that its citizens can be excused for believing it eternal. An empire to which the Western world owes almost its entire way of life. An empire which gave the modern West its languages, laws, forms of governments, and philosophies. For millennia, the civilized world was dominated by the men and women of the most famous imperial city in history, Rome. An ancient city which at its height was a teeming metropolis of over 1 million people. For generations, crowds from all corners of the empire could be seen surging through the streets on their way to the public baths, gymnasium, the theater, or the Colosseum. Rome united the people of a vast empire, men of 1,000 kingdoms under one banner. A man from Britain could travel from London to Egypt and only need to speak one language and use the same currency. Never had the world been so united. This unity and prosperity were maintained through masterful diplomacy, distracting entertainments, efficiency, and perhaps most important of all, a military far surpassing any other in existence. The Roman legions were unmatched in discipline, technology, training, and ruthless efficiency. The citizens of Rome called their native city the Eternal City. To a Roman, the very idea that an empire could fall would have been laughable. Their empire was the world itself, and their protectors were the gods of Olympus. At the center of this empire sat Rome, a city founded as a collection of small farming communities in the 8th century BC, which grew to become a city of 1 million. Rome dwarfed the first human cities of Mesopotamia which came before it. It had sewers, aqueducts, multi-story apartment complexes, public baths, public restrooms, theaters, central heating, a fire service, and many other amenities which would be familiar to us moderns today. The inhabitants of Rome were a diverse people. The population was not divided ethnically like many modern nations have been, but by class. A man from Africa could be a Roman citizen and own a slave captured from rebellious British tribes. Roman citizenship was highly desirable across the empire. A man who attained the protection of Rome was no longer the equal of his neighbor, but a step above the social ladder of the ancient world. Before the rise of Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire, the Romans were also religiously tolerant people. The polytheistic religions of the ancient world mingled and exchanged gods, and the Romans respected the antiquity of the monotheistic religions of Judaism and Zoroastrianism. Although many different gods were worshipped within the borders of the Roman Empire, the official state gods were the Olympians, the 12 gods who dwelt upon Mount Olympus. The chief god of the Romans was Jupiter, who in Greece was known as Zeus. The Romans also borrowed gods from across the empire. For example, the cult of the Egyptian god Isis became popular across Italy, and the Persian god Mithras was worshipped by influential men within the army. The willingness of Romans to experiment with religions is what led to the rise of Christianity within the Roman Empire. For much of its existence, Christianity was viewed as just another Eastern mystery cult like that of the Persian Mithras. However, the attractiveness of Jesus' teachings and the promise of a pleasant afterlife first attracted the attention of the lower classes of society, spreading later to the middle classes and ruling elite. Eventually, Christianity grew to supplant all other religions in the empire, and this Roman Christianity developed into the Roman Catholicism we know today, whose ruler, like the emperor of old, sits in a grand palace in Rome. Rome was once a small kingdom, dominated by autocratic rulers who were often also foreign. Roman tradition stated that the first king was called Romulus, who had killed his brother Remus in a quarrel over who would rule the new city. Eventually, the Romans overthrew their kings and founded a republic. This republic was ruled and administered by officials who were elected by citizen assemblies. The highest authority was held by the 2 consuls, who were advised by the Senate. The Senate was a council of magistrates who were generally extremely rich and commanded the greatest respect in Roman society. Under the Republic, the small state of Rome began to rapidly expand into an empire. At first, the Romans conquered Italy and Sicily. Later, a series of conflicts in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC saw the Romans conquer the powerful Carthaginian Empire of Africa and eventually defeat the Greeks. Through the 2nd and 1st centuries, the Romans gradually began to swallow up the kingdoms which had once formed part of the empire of Alexander the Great. In the 1st century, the great statesman and general Julius Caesar would add Gaul to the empire, and would even launch an expedition into Britain. Julius Caesar was born into a famous and wealthy aristocratic family known as the gens Julia. According to legend, his family could trace their ancestry back to the Trojan prince Aeneas, and therefore to the goddess Venus herself. Caesar was a pure-blooded Roman aristocrat who could trace his family's origins back to the beginnings of Roman history. Yet it was this powerful statesman who would bring the Republic to an end. The glories won by Caesar and his unrestrained political ambition led to the Republic declaring him a public enemy, thus sending the empire into civil war. Yet Caesar, masterful general, won the war and declared himself dictator of Rome. Yet his rule was not to last, and he was assassinated by Republicans. Nevertheless, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, Augustus, would truly put an end to the Republic, becoming Rome's first emperor. Under the emperor, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent. In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius conquered Britain, and the conquest continued up until the emperor Trajan brought Mesopotamia into the empire in 117 AD. Rome had conquered the land which had given birth to humanity's first empires. In 117 AD, Rome controlled a territory consisting of most of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. From the 2nd century BC to the 5th century AD, Rome was the ancient world's most powerful empire, a cultural and military superpower. Yet by the 4th century, new powers were appearing on the horizon. A vast horde of warriors known as the Huns were driving westward, leaving a wake of destruction, with eyes set on the riches of Rome. Cities were being sacked, farms burned, and a great many taken prisoner or slaughtered. As the Huns pushed into Central Europe, all tribes beyond the borders of Rome fled before their unstoppable advance. As a result, a great horde of migrants, fleeing the terrors of Attila, began to approach the Roman Empire. One such group, known as the Goths, like the Sea Peoples of the Bronze Age collapse, the exact origins of the Goths are unknown. Many believe that they originally came from Scandinavia. What we do know about them is that they spoke in Eastern Germanic dialect and were excellent warriors. Nevertheless, the Goths had been unable to stand up to the sheer number of Huns moving into their lands, and these once proud peoples had been forced into the indignity of migrant life. When this vast caravan of Germanic refugees reached the borders of the Roman Empire, they requested entry and settlement from the Roman Emperor Valens. Valens allowed the Goths to enter the empire and settle down into allied communities. However, the Goths were looked down on by the elites of Roman society as barbarians, and were continually exploited by corrupt governors and officials. The Goths, therefore, took up arms to defend their rights and their honor. In 378 AD, the Emperor Valens led a large Roman army against the rebellious migrants. When the Romans arrived, the Gothic warriors, commanded by King Fridolin, formed a large circle to protect their women and children. With their entire world protected within this circle, the men of the Goths prepared to fight to the death. Just as all seemed lost for these surrounded warriors, a Gothic cavalry force arrived and surrounded the Romans. In a single afternoon, 2/3 of the Roman army, including the Emperor Valens, were killed. From this point onwards, the Roman army would continually struggle to hold back the barbarians, gradually losing more and more territory. In 443 AD, the Huns themselves finally broke into the Roman Empire, reaching the gates of Rome before disease forced them to retreat. Yet even as the military power of Rome was fading, the empire was collapsing from within. The Roman economy was originally a slave economy, but as the empire stopped expanding, the legions stopped capturing slaves. Alongside this, the currency of the late empire was becoming gradually more inflated, and the gulf between the rich and the poor was widening. The wealthy often dodged taxes, and the poor were unable to pay them. Continual wars with barbarian hordes and rebellious generals also meant that the coffers were perpetually strained. As a result, the Roman Empire could barely afford to defend its western provinces of Britain, France, Spain, and Africa, each of which were gradually abandoned to Goths, Vandals, Saxons, and other barbarian tribes. In 476 BC, Italy and at last Rome fell to barbarians. The western half of the Roman Empire fractured into various kingdoms. Italy and Rome became part of a new kingdom of Italy under the Germanic king Odoacer. Yet although the Western Roman Empire had collapsed, the East survived with its own emperor and has been labeled by scholars as the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, however, did not call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans. The last city of this Eastern Roman Empire did not truly fall until it was captured by Turks in 1453 AD, only 30 years before Columbus sailed to America. Thus, the Roman Empire remains the longest-lasting empire in history. Nevertheless, the fall of the city of Rome and the Western Roman provinces marked the end of the true classical empire of Caesar and Augustus. The empire fell in the end as a result of a combination of internal and external factors. The gradual degradation of the Roman economy and social structure weakened the army and allowed for vast hordes of migrant barbarians to overrun the empire and create their own kingdoms. Yet the legacy of Rome endures today. European and American language, culture, and politics still bears the marks of this long-lost empire. So strong was the cultural legacy of Rome that the founding fathers of America consciously founded their new republic on the Roman Republic of old. The story of the Roman Empire proves that no matter how powerful and long-lasting an empire seems, it cannot last forever. The ancient Romans were so confident in the immortality of the empire that they often referred to Rome as the Eternal City. Yet time and history proved them wrong. We must now travel forward in time by around 1,000 years and journey far to the east of Rome to a land known as Mongolia, a land destined to birth one of the largest empires in world history. The Mongolian Empire differs from those we have previously explored in that it was not founded by an urban people. The Mongolians of the 13th century were nomadic horse riders roaming the vast steppes of Mongolia, moving their herds from grassland to grassland and living a simple life. Few at the time would have suspected that these humble peoples would go on to rule one of humanity's largest empires. Yet the Mongols were also incredible skilled warriors, especially in the art of horse archery, in which the Mongolian warrior would ride at high speeds while simultaneously shooting arrows from his powerful composite bow. This method of warfare had been common among nomadic peoples for thousands of years. The nomadic Huns who had invaded the Roman Empire used the same tactics long before the rise of Mongolia. The Mongols, however, perfected this deadly art form. For centuries, these fierce warriors had harassed the settled civilizations of China, wreaking havoc with their fast-moving raiders. The threats posed by the Mongols forced the Chinese to construct one of mankind's most impressive feats in engineering, the Great Wall of China. The wall, estimated to be around 21,196 kilometers long, protected the empires of China for generations. China, in the 13th century, was the home of the great imperial dynasties of the Jin and Song. These dynasties ruled over large organized states, populated by sprawling cities and protected by the Great Wall. Yet their prosperity was about to come to an end. In 1206, the most famous Mongol of them all, Genghis Khan, was proclaimed the ruler of all Mongolian tribes. Now the vast hordes of the steppes were commanded by a single man and guided by his vision of an endless empire. The Mongol army became highly organized and structured and began to move beyond the borders of Mongolia. The first nation to fall to the unrelenting tide of Mongolian warriors was China. The Mongolians used deception and speed to continuously defeat the less mobile Chinese armies, and eventually the Mongolian armies simply went around the Great Wall to sweep across China. The once humble steppe nomads were now the masters of one of the most advanced nations in the world. Genghis, the great Khan of Mongolia, had unleashed an unstoppable force. The Mongols continued to spread their empire even after the death of Genghis Khan. Between 1206 and 1260, the Mongol horde would advance undefeated across the world, eventually forging the largest continuous land empire in history. The Khanate of Mongolia covered much of Asia and Eastern Europe. At its height, the empire covered all of modern-day Mongolia, parts of Burma, Romania, Siberia, Pakistan, Ukraine, Belarus, Cilicia, Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Iran, Iraq, Central Asia, and all of Russia. An empire of staggering proportions, dwarfing even the Roman Empire by an incredible order of magnitude. The Mongolians forged this empire through a mixture of military prowess, tactical and strategic genius, and sheer ruthlessness. The Mongolians were some of the most ruthless conquerors the world has ever seen. Usually, the chance for surrender was given only once by a Mongol commander. If this was refused, then a nation would face complete destruction and slaughter. It is estimated that the Mongolian conquests resulted in the deaths of between 40 and 70 million people worldwide, making the wars of Mongolian expansion the second most deadly conflict in history after the Second World War. Yet when the Mongolian army had completed its expansion, a long period of peace and prosperity, known as the Pax Mongolica, settled across Europe and Asia. At the empire's height in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongol rulers maintained peace and prosperity in the various provinces of their empire. They were largely successful in this because although they were fierce warriors, they were highly tolerant rulers. For example, the Mongol Khans did not force their subjects to adopt their own religious and cultural traditions. The Mongols were also successful in controlling such an enormous empire because they enforced a strict legal code known as the Yasa, meaning great law, which severely punished disobedience. The laws also controlled the military institutions of the empire and allowed the Khan to quickly raise very large armies to defend the state and suppress potential uprisings. Because of the peace and stability of the empire, one of the most profitable trade routes for the Mongols was the Silk Road from Asia to Europe. The Silk Road transported luxury items such as silk, spices, precious stones from east to west, allowing the Mongol Empire to become incredibly rich. The famous Phoenician explorer Marco Polo traveled across this route and brought back valuable information about the East to Europe's rulers. The end of the Mongol conquest came about when they were defeated for the first time. In 1260, the previously unstoppable advance of the Khanate was halted by the forces of the Muslim Mamluk Sultanate, an empire covering much of the Middle East and parts of North Africa. Following this defeat, the empire began to fracture into a series of smaller, although still massive, Mongolian empires. Some of these include the Timurid, Mughal, and Yuan empires. By the 15th century, the true Mongolian Empire had been dissolved, and its legacy only survived in India through the Mughal Empire, which itself did not fall until 1707. Yet the Mughal Empire, though founded by a Mongol, was now more Indian than Mongolian. The Mongolian Empire was one of the largest empires in history and was conquered at a remarkable speed. Its strength allowed it and its successor empires to flourish for centuries. Yet the empire, founded through glorious conquest, was slowly and ingloriously swallowed by the sands of time, like all before it. Although the Mongol Empire was indeed the largest continuous land-based empire in history, it still does not hold first place in history's largest empires. The prize for first place is held by one of the most influential empires in history, the British Empire. The British Empire had its origins as early as the 16th century. This century marked the beginning of the age of colonization, when European states began to make use of improved technologies to expand beyond the borders of Europe. The first colonies established by England were in North America, specifically in Virginia. The 16th century also saw the English looking to the east for further commercial and colonial expansion. The East India Company of England began to establish a small empire of trading stations across India. These would eventually grow greatly in size. Soon after, the British also began moving into the West Indies, with the first colonies here established in the 1620s. In the Americas, England began founding colonies, which would grow into some of the great metropolises of the modern world. For instance, in 1664, England took control of the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which they soon renamed New York, now the largest city of the United States and one of the largest in the world. The 1600s saw England lay seeds of a great empire, but it was not until the 1700s when the empire truly began to grow. This century saw Britain fighting a series of fierce wars with France for control of India and the Americas. The most destructive of these wars was the 7 Years' War of 1756 through 1763. The British were eventually victorious in all theaters of the war and forced France to concede vast territories in India, America, and the Caribbean. The British Empire was now a true superpower with very few competitors. Yet the empire was to take a severe blow when in 1775, the American colonies raised the flag of rebellion. The 13 British colonies of America had, over the years, began to form their own national identity apart from their European origins. With a growing self-identity came a resentment of control and taxes. The war saw France, Spain, and the Dutch supporting the rebels in order to weaken the British Empire, with Britain's only ally being the German state of Hanover. In the resulting 8-year conflict, the British eventually lost the will to continue fighting such a costly war so far from home and decided to grant the colonies their independence. Although the American rebels were at a disadvantage compared to the more professional British Army, foreign and native support made up for this, and at the same time, appetite for war back at home in Britain gradually weakened. In the end, the British decided to focus their efforts elsewhere and granted the colonies their independence. These colonies would become the United States of America. Although the rebels tried to force the British to cede Canada as well, a series of defeats at the hands of British and Loyalist Canadian forces meant that Canada remained a part of the British Empire. Canada had originally been a largely French territory, but it was captured from France by British in the 7 Years' War. The loss of these American colonies brought to an end what historians called the First British Empire. Yet the British, eager for more land, would continue their expansion elsewhere. The Second British Empire would become the largest empire in history. The British expanded their control over huge swaths of Africa, the Middle East, India, much of Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and many other territories. At its height in 1922, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the world. No other empire in history has ever rivaled the British Empire in size. The 20th century saw the British Empire at the height of its power, yet this century would also see its downfall. As the century wore on, a series of factors led the British to decide to gradually grant their imperial territories independence. The first of these were economic. The empire was beginning to cost more than it was making, and the British economy had become severely weakened during 2 world wars. The second of these was an increasing global pressure from the colonial powers to allow their subjects to rule themselves. As relations between the United States and the British Empire grew closer in this period, the Americans began to continually pressure their ally to grant their colonies freedom. This was also a time of changing opinions in Britain about the nature of empire, as more people began to recognize the harm the empire had caused to many of its subject peoples. By 1997, the British colony Hong Kong was handed back to China, thus ending the long history of the world's largest empire. The empire was replaced by the British Commonwealth, a democratic and voluntary association of the former territories of the empire. Thus, unlike many of the other empires of our journey, the British Empire did not collapse as a result of violence or environmental disaster, but gradually and largely peacefully dismantled itself. Nevertheless, like all empires, the British Empire was destined to fall. The legacy of the British Empire was enormous. The cultural, political, and technological achievements of the empire have shaped the modern world. Without it, there would never have been an industrial revolution. The countries of America, Australia, New Zealand, and others would not exist, and the English language would not be the most important language of our era. So, our journey, which began with the birth of history's first empires, ends with the fall of its last and largest. The rise and fall of human empires is a predictable story, a story of small beginnings, great achievements, and an inevitable downfall. Yet, although the fall of every empire is inevitable, the legacies and achievements of each one leaves human civilization permanently changed. Nations may disappear, emperors may die, and monuments may be swallowed by the sands of the desert, but empires live on beyond their collapse through the cultural and technological impacts they leave on the world. Nevertheless, we must learn from the patterns of history. We must not make the mistake of believing the world around us is permanent, of thinking our own societal constructs will last forever. Our modern, connected, and technologically advanced empire faces many of the same challenges as our ancestors. The only question remains is, how will we learn from the past and prepare for the future?